Welcome to this Master's Seminar on Women, Peace Processes and Peace Agreements, Reflections from Northern Ireland, a seminar that is taking place as part of the Transitional Justice Institute's LLM in Gender, Conflict and Human Rights, and LLM Human Rights and Transitional Justice. My name is Rory O'Connell. I'm Director of the Transitional Justice Institute, along with Associate Director, Professor Fionnuala Ní Éileán, and I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm going to say a few words about the Transitional Justice Institute, our TJI, and our LLM programs, and our speaker today. First of all, some housekeeping for our visitors who are observing this and participating over the internet. Your microphones are muted for this event, but please do use the chat function if you have any questions that you wish to ask. If you have any internet connection problems, don't worry. We are recording this session and it will be made available subsequently. So first of all, let me tell you a bit about the Transitional Justice Institute, our TJI. TJI is one of Ulster University's 15 research institutes. We are a law-led, multidisciplinary research center focusing on transitional justice. That's to say how societies deal with transition from conflict or oppression. And in addition, we also conduct research on related areas like human rights, international law, peace, and conflict. There are a few things that stand out in terms of our research. First of all, we focus on world-leading and internationally excellent research. And we know that our research is world-leading and internationally excellent through various indicators. For instance, many of our staff have received prizes from the American Society of International Law, the Socio-Legal Studies Association, and other organizations. Two of our staff, for instance, have received the prestigious Basil Chubb Prize for writing the best dissertation on politics in the island of Ireland. In addition, every 5 or 6 years, the United Kingdom conducts an independent audit of the research quality conducted in its universities. And in the most recent such exercise, the research produced by this unit was ranked 4th out of more than 60 law units participating in that exercise. Perhaps even more importantly, we put considerable emphasis on the idea that research must have an impact in the world. When TJI was set up in 2003, it was with a very conscious ethos that we were committed to action-oriented research, a research with impact. And so many of our scholars are actively involved in community groups, non-governmental organizations, public sector bodies, trying to translate the research conducted in this institution into real-life impact. And again, the excellence of our work in this area was recognized in the UK's independent audit of research quality when we were ranked 1st in the United Kingdom for our research impact. We were the only law unit in the United Kingdom to have 100% of our research impact rated at the highest level of excellence. We are also a multidisciplinary research institute. So while law-led, we also include scholars with backgrounds in psychology, political science, women's studies, sociology. And even among those of us who have a law background, we constantly stress the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature of our research. And TJI also has an important education mission. We run an extremely well-attended, high-quality international summer school every year. We run short courses, such as on gender and transition. And we also run 2 master's programs, the LLM in Human Rights and Transitional Justice, and the LLM in Gender, Conflict, and Human Rights. While Masters in Law programs, both of these programs are open to applicants with degrees in the humanities and social sciences, and are open to people who can demonstrate a real interest and experience in the themes of these master's programs. All of these master's programs are research-led, and we have the people who are literally writing the books at the cutting edge of transitional justice, human rights, gender, conflict, sitting in the classroom conducting the classes, as we'll hear today. All of our classes are also highly interactive. We have an excellent staff-student ratio. None of our classes have more than 18 students in them, and they take place over 3-hour blocks. This allows us to have highly interactive discussions where our students and staff can exchange ideas, insight, and experience. And this is important because as well as having wonderful teachers, we also are very proud of our wonderful students who bring with them enthusiasm, diverse experience, a commitment to excellence, and a genuine interest in the topics that we are studying. So our master's programs are one of the most delightful and insightful teaching experiences that we can offer. We, of course, benefit from having excellent staff and also excellent visiting staff. Today we have a visiting professor, Dr. Avila Kilmurray, who is excellently well placed to lead the seminar discussion on the topic for today. So Avila is a long-standing community activist and someone who works in philanthropy. She has more than 4 decades of experience working both locally and globally on these issues. And we are delighted that she is a visiting professor with us here in the Transitional Justice Institute. A final note, just to say that I hope you will stay in touch with TJI. You can follow us on Twitter, you can like us on Facebook, you can sign up for our emails. But now I'm going to hand you over to the seminar. This is part of the Gender and Transition module. Doctors Catherine O'Rourke and Jessica Doyle are teachers on it. But today we have, as I say, a very special visitor, visiting professor, Dr. Avila Kilmurray. Avila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rory, and it's lovely to be with you this nice, bright, sunny morning. So what I want to do today is to look at women and peace process in Northern Ireland, looking at 4 different aspects. First of all, the roots of that participation. How did women get involved, particularly during the actual violence of the conflict from the late 1960s? And then to look at some of the tactics and strategies that were used in terms of that involvement. And then to look at the period around the ceasefires where it was a bit more space for women to actually think of other ways of participation and of raising their voices. We'll have a coffee break, tea break, I think then about 10:45, half 10, 10:45, depending how we go. And then in the latter part, what I want to do is look at specifically the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, how it developed, what were some of the challenges. I speak with a degree of experience with that because I was a founder member of the coalition and I was a member of their negotiating team for the Good Friday Agreement. But then also perhaps if we could touch on some of the issues that came up when we were actually negotiating the agreement. And lastly then, looking back, what could we have done better, what were the mistakes that were made, and other issues that really would be useful for people as they go forward with peace agreements. But I sort of threw up that little poem there, well, it's an extract from a poem by Van Boland. And it's one that I always like because it sort of almost captures the quandary, I suppose, about women and participation. And she's basically saying that, that women were never at the scene of the crime. That they were always round it, that in the case, she's reflecting here on the execution, obviously, during the French Revolution of the French king, that women were there, they were knitting, or they were, in the audience, but they were actually not part of the process. Why? Because they were involved in the household or whatever else. And I was wondering, does that resonate with you? Do you think that's still true today, or is that just a historic reflection?
I think, there's the preconceived notion, that women's place in the household, and I think, culturally, it's still ingrained in some societies. Mm-hmm. But I think, with the whole sort of explosion of women's rights, and, women like the work that it has sort of shifted the paradigm, but still that sort of still there, I think. Sure. Certain cultures, women should be in the house. Mm-hmm.
I think maybe the problem is also, I think we were saying this last week, is that in history lessons, in education and media, you're never told about women's role in any conflict. And we always did, well, almost always did have, maybe it wasn't as combatants, but as peacemakers or organising, they were involved, but we just aren't told about it.
So it's almost like a sort of a silent.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should. Anybody else? Okay, well, taking up that point then. These are two pictures from the sort of late 1960s and then the mid 1970s. The first one is Civil Rights March by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, and actually it will be the 50th anniversary next month, the 7th, 8th of April, of the setting up of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. And that was very much modelled on the sort of the American Martin Luther King experience at the time, I suppose the sort of the slightly less so, but some of the agitation that you would have had in Paris. So the atmosphere at the time was to look at rights. And it's quite interesting because, you know, at the moment, over past years, we've had more discussions in Northern Ireland about the implementation of a Bill of Rights. But actually, the idea of a Bill of Rights was really sort of very strong in the late 1960s. And NICRA, as it became to be called, actually drafted, in legal terms, the first model of Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. It was called the Bill of Civil and Rights. And actually, the other thing that's completely missed in history, as you pointed out, is that the second model Bill of Rights was drafted on the Shankill Road by a guy called Sammy Smith, who was later assassinated by Republicans. And that was in 1975. So you had NICRA, which was largely nationalist, but also tried to reach out to members of the Protestant community, and then a very discreetly sort of loyalist contribution in terms of the rights debate, and they're both forgotten about. They're never referred to, because now human rights can be often sort of characterised as a Republican demand, but actually it forgets that Sammy Smith and the loyalists were saying, we need rights too, and drafted a bill. But the interesting thing in terms of gender is that, again, you know, most of the histories will talk about human rights as sort of John Hume or Ivan Cooper or Emma McCann or whoever else. But actually that front row is Madge Davidson in the centre, who was the Secretary General of NICRA, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. The woman over here with the long scarf is Anne Hope, who again is still with us and still active, and became a sort of a leading activist in the trade union movement, and indeed in the women's movement. And I'm not sure who the third woman is, but they actually formed the front line of that march, and actually they deliberately formed the front line because that was the march that took place in Kilmurray the weekend after Bloody Sunday, where the civil rights demonstrators in Derry had been shot. So it was making the point of women forming the front line. The second picture is of the peace movement in 1976, where there was major demonstrations calling for an end to violence, and it was peace women that set it up. Marie Corrigan, because her sister and nieces and nephews had been killed as a result of a car that was actually had IRA people in it. The driver was shot by the army and then crashed into them, and they were killed. And she joined with Betty Williams as a Protestant to set up the Peace Women. But again, that picture shows the women out demonstrating. Within a year, it became the Peace People, because it was seen as a sort of a political force, and it was very much then diluted in many ways. And I think actually possibly lost some of its edge in terms of, you know, that it lost its feminist focus. And very interestingly, and words are so important in conflict situations, it also, as a response to the demand for peace, you had then from the Republican side, peace with justice. So, you know, when you throw out something like that, it then can be nuanced into something that actually throws up something quite different. I think the other point from those early years, which is still true today, is that women aren't homogeneous. You know, very often we used to get people coming to Northern Ireland, and I think you still get people going to different conflict situations saying, we want to work with women because they're the peacemakers. Well, actually, not necessarily. You know, women are as different as the communities and politics that are all around the place, because you find them everywhere. The first slide is of two, at that time it was Kilmurray, women's section of the IRA, manning a checkpoint. The second slide is a slide of Elizabeth Hyland, who was a 15-year-old girl who was tarred and feathered after being held for 5 days. And again, tarring and feathering was largely carried out in Republican areas for young girls that were either accused of dating soldiers or of giving information. And that was a picture from the hospital bed. So again, at that stage, you had people that were active in military organizations, largely women on the Republican side, but certainly in supportive role with loyalist organizations as well. You had women that were being victimized, you had women that would have supported peace women, so a whole range of different political involvements, and that's still true and been true in most societies. So we can't just talk about women as a bloc. A lot of the early activism came through necessity. So you had the picture over here is of Bombay Street. It was the large-scale intimidation, which happened on both sides of the community, over the years, particularly the years from the sort of the early 1970s to the mid-70s, but continued on a drip basis after that as well, where people were pushed out of their of communities, particularly communities that were mixed Catholic and Protestant, as fear and rumour and apprehension expanded. And they sort of took refuge with, in inverted commas, their own. So what we had was the development of single identity communities, as you know, that are now reinforced by the peace walls. And because of that necessity, you have women, particularly women, actually, becoming active at local community level. Because they had to identify houses for families to go into, babies' nappies supplied, where was the food coming from. So very much the local community organisations coming together in those sort of particularly working class areas. Obviously it didn't affect middle class areas to an extent, to try and deal with families that were flooding in. And actually in 1971, which was coincided with the introduction of internment ground trial that we had for the first 4 to 5 years, we had the biggest shift in population in Northern Ireland of any place since the Second World War. And that was before the Yugoslavian sort of split up and the war there, which obviously was much bigger than we had here, but it was still fairly major for a small population. And then we also had obviously the first barriers that then the community started manning themselves as defenderism, but then became the basis for the peace walls. Because when the British Army came in, they reinforced those barriers as a way of keeping the two communities apart. And actually, it's always something that I sort of say is quite interesting in policy terms, because so often you get understandable, sort of common sense, short-term solutions you put in place that then becomes almost like a politics of unintended consequences. So, putting it along barbed wire barriers to keep communities apart, then becomes peace walls, then becomes almost seen as protection by the people living either side of the peace walls. And now we're in a situation where we still have what? About 57 peace walls across Belfast. And some being built after the ceasefires, and a really difficulty in actually bringing them down. What was the aim that was thrown out by the government recently? 2025, was it, to have all the peace walls down? Yeah. And still not a lot of movement in terms of that. So, something that was short-term made sense, let's keep these apart, became then a policy that actually had major long-term implications. And then the second slide is again from that sort of early 1970s period, where you see the British Army on the streets there, soldiers, armed soldiers in the streets. The area has just been is cleaning up after a bomb blast. And almost how in a protracted conflict, it's almost like the normalization of the abnormal. That, it becomes, for many people, the norm to have armed soldiers on the streets. And I mean, there's plenty of photographs of youngsters going home from school with the armed patrols with corn or whatever else. And what was interesting was, because over the last number of years, again, to try and sort of fill in some of the holes in the hidden history, I interviewed about 120 community activists on all sides of the conflict, and some statutory workers. And the statutory workers, particularly because they were going in from outside these communities, saying how encompassed it was within small communities. And if you were coming from a sort of a reasonably wealthy area, it was just like two different worlds almost, but coexisting. And again, this thing about, how that can happen over quite an extended period of time. And as a result, that you get very different narratives growing up about what is it like, to live in those communities. All of you are too young to remember that, but have you, I'm sure you've heard stories about what it was like in that period?
Yeah.
Any shared stories?
I still kind of feel a bit like that now. I live in North Belfast.
Uh-huh.
And I think when the protests went up to Hotel and the police were around helicopters every night and with the time, and you're like, is this thing? It was very strange for a long time.
I know, yeah. Or maybe the helicopters, because you just feel.
Yeah, because there was one out last night and I was like, oh, not again.
And when they had the searchlights going down. And actually, my memory of, because I was working as a community worker during those days, and actually my memory was almost of that it was easier to stay in the situation than, say, go down south or whatever, go leave Northern Ireland and then come back to it. Because people just, didn't get, we weren't all as sort of conscious to an extent of the intensity of it until you actually got out. And then it was almost more difficult dealing with people who would say, what's it like with the Troubles? And you could see them almost glazing over after you spoke for about 3 minutes because they were going on to something else. So it was almost more frustrating. It was almost better to stay in the situation. But again, it was the circumstances that gave rise to a lot of community action. And again, because it was almost very sort of day-to-day community action, trying to keep the lights on, keep normality going in some sort of sense, that it tended to be women that actually were the backbone of that. And there's some really funny stories from those days as well. There was one friend of mine told me she and her sister were Protestant, lived in the Grosvenor Road, which was a big stair at the time, and then were intimidated out and they went up to Spring Martin. But she said because of the barricades, you couldn't see what was going on in the other community. So they were out for a night like this, it was a nice night, and all they heard was 1, 7, 15, 25 coming from the other side of the barricade. Sister, that's them training, that's them training with their arms on the Catholic side. It turned out they were playing bingo. They were sitting there at the doorstep, So let's look at some of the voices. As I say, I did some interviews with various community activists. And the first one is a woman who, actually it's a North Belfast one, who was intimidated out of 2 houses in North Belfast, and actually her mother-in-law was blinded by a plastic bullet. And she moved her family over to Andersonstown in West Belfast, Catholic area, as a squatter, because there was no formality in the system. People just took law into their own hands. But her quote there is very much basically saying, how informal the whole thing was. A lot of the NGO sector now, and even the community sector, it's quite formalised. But actually it was people, and largely women, just coming together to do what they could to help their neighbours or help other people that were squatters. And a wee bit of illegality, because they were actually passing the formal electricity system to wire up each other's houses. In fact, she described it as being like a Dodge City. And the second one quote is actually from a woman who later became quite politically active, and she was basically saying that leaders just emerge. And she was actually talking about a woman who was a community leader in Dibbs Flats in the Falls Road. And they become somewhat more visible in crisis. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that visibility or that activism translates into the form of political system. It is seen as something that is just informal and it's happening out of necessity, and women just get on with it, basically. And when she describes it there as, it was just holding things together. And it was almost that sort of sense, it was short term, it was immediate, it wasn't necessarily looking forward, to the longer term aspiration. It was doing what had to be done. And there's a lot of sort of descriptions of that happening right across all the different communities in Northern Ireland. I should say, look, do feel free to ask questions or interrupt me, because otherwise I'll just go on. So in terms of the actual women's movement, the women's sector emerging, to an extent, it was actually slower in Northern Ireland than it was, say, in the Republic or in Britain, and clearly than it was in America or continental Europe, because the early civil rights movement and the Troubles almost, it was dominant. So a lot of women who otherwise would have been active in an early women's movement put their energies into dealing with that early Troubles, because that was what was on their doorstep. But by the mid-1970s, you did have the emergence of almost like issue-based women's organisations and a sort of more a feminist analysis of what was going on. And one of the things that actually helped that happen was in 1975, there was the big UN Women's Conference in Beijing. And there was a lot of, sorry, not in Beijing, Beijing was 1995. It was one of the earlier women's conferences, but it took a lot of emphasis on women's issues. And one of the organisations that set up in Northern Ireland to respond to that and to put in submissions to that was the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement, which came out really of students in Queen's University and working with some women activists in the community and starting to put together a charter. They put together a charter of rights. And it was things like childcare, because we didn't have any childcare at the time. It was things like divorce legislation, because our divorce legislation was from the 1860s or something. It was very basic, women's issues that were put together in that charter. And from that then, we had a start of the recognition and celebration of International Women's Day, which again tried to put a focus on the 8th of March every year on some aspect of women's issues. Oh dear, we've lost her.
This is probably no, Avila. This is no with the mouse, should be okay.
Oh, click no with the mouse. Okay. Right, no. The other development we had was down here women's aid, because again, issues like domestic violence had been ignored, because the whole emphasis was on the violence in terms of what's going on the street. Bombing campaigns, obviously, from both political sides, British Army in terms of their trial, the sort of arrests and raids on a nightly basis. And by the sort of the mid-1970s, 1975 again, with the first women's aid refuge opened in Belfast for victims of domestic violence. I was involved the following year in opening one in Derry, where I was working at the time. And we initially approached the social services, and they said it wasn't an issue. We then approached, who else we approached? We had approached the housing executive, who were responsible for social housing, and said that we need accommodation. And they said, oh, nobody's ever complained to us about domestic violence. So we actually ended up squatting in a vacant public building in Pub Street in centre Derry. And I remember the unionist MP at the time, Willie Ross, demanding we be imprisoned because it was against the Prevention of Terrorism Act to take over public buildings. And we were denounced from the altar of the Catholic Church for breaking up marriages. So that was, 1975, that was the atmosphere at the time, that something like domestic violence could not be named because it was tantamount to breaking up violence. And by naming an issue, you were actually putting it on the table and people had to deal with it. And we opened the refuge, and that first year we had something like 70 women and children taking refuge in it. And I always remember an elderly woman, well, actually she wasn't that elderly, she looked really elderly, coming down from Cregan, the housing estate in Derry, and saying to us, I only wish that you had been here 20 years ago. And she had white hair and she was blind in one eye from the battle that she got from her husband. And she sort of said, look, I'm here to give you my support because it was raging controversy in the Derry Journal and whatever else, and to sort of say this is really needed. And it just shows how women's issues can stay hidden when they're not named and when they're seen as abnormal in some way, So Women's Aid, and it spread then in terms of different parts of Northern Ireland. That was a major movement, a major issue. We also had to start, we had at the time the Equality Commission, as is now, the Equal Agency, which did put some focus on women's issues, more in terms of women and work issues. Because again, at that time, and it's interesting in terms of the Brexit debate, we just joined the European Union. That was the first equality legislation we had. Until then, if you worked in a bank, if you worked in the civil service or whatever else, you were dismissed when you were married. Because married women were expected to be home bringing up the children. And it was European Union equality legislation and having to come into line with that actually shifted that. So the Equality Agency was important. And then we also had the development, the start of the seeds towards the later 70s, early 80s of women's centres in local communities, where again the focus was starting to be put on bringing women together as distinct from women as support people or support in the sort of tenants associations, community associations, and the political associations and movements. So the first two were Ballabeen out in East Belfast, and the Falls Women's Centre in West Belfast, in local areas. But before that, the women's rights movement had actually set one up in downtown Belfast and Broad Street. And that was an interesting discussion, because again, in terms of women becoming active, the question was, the reason the women's rights movement set it up in downtown Belfast was because it was sort of seen as neutral, that everyone could go. But actually what happened was the women from local areas didn't tend to go because they stayed in their areas. So then you had the development of local women's centres. And then the other form of activism that we had developing was women in the trade union movement. That picture up there is Iris McCormick, who was a leading women trade unionist, but there was a lot of women that actually came to the trade union movement and that got a sort of an education to the trade union movement. So all those roots were there long before women actually became involved very visibly in the form of politics. And then we had very locally based women's groups, who again came together largely because women were caught in the home and came together within their own local single identity communities. And they then networked in something called the Women's Information Day Group, which brought all those locally based women's groups together on a monthly basis. Last Friday of every month, they would send out to the buses and they would identify a venue and bring those people together. So again, they were identified and organised through some key workers. They met initially in neutral venues, in venues that were neither seen as Catholic or Protestant, Republican or Loyalist, either downtown or in something like the Youth Action's premises in Hampton or whatever else. But then they took a major decision in the sort of the early 1980s that the women were curious. They actually wanted to know what was going on the other side of the peace wall. you know, the houses in Raccoon different from the houses in Ardoyne, or Falls and Shankill or whatever else. So they decided to rotate their meetings, alternately, in different venues. So this month they would meet in a Catholic Republican Nationalist area, next month in a Protestant Unionist Loyalist area. And they did that right through the Troubles. And they always said, one of the women that actually, well, they just had the one woman at the time who was the organizer, Captain Feenan, and she sort of said, look, if we stop meeting because of a major bomb or an explosion, then we will always be in the court of public opinion. Why did you stop meeting at that bomb and not that bomb? So again, it was this sort of thing, you know, to try and avoid the whataboutery, was we have to keep meeting, even if we only get 4 or 5, because there's mayhem on the streets the night before, we will keep that going. And the other thing that she used to say was, you know, she was very deliberate in terms of thinking, who's not there? What groups are not there? Is it mainly nationalist groups that we have coming? Therefore, she said, I need to deliberately go out with an apple tart in this hand and ask someone to put on the Catholic, you know, with the other, to sort of say to a loyalist area, to say, will you come along next meeting? You know, we'll have the bus or whatever else. She was very conscious of where the gaps were, or you know, she might say, we're going to hold off from West Belfast, you know, and East Belfast, but nobody from North Belfast, whatever else. So again, that's I think one of the points that's quite important. That in a divided society, particularly organising in a divided society, you have to think through who's not there and why is it they may not be there, and then make a very conscious effort to actually reach out to bring them in. And there were some quotes again from the Women's Information Day group. The importance of information in terms of gaining confidence and getting things done, and information as a source of power. And recognising that actually the information you get in divided communities can be very different depending on where you're living, because it's formed through, if you like, the prism of the narrative that community develops. And then the Women's Information Day, and what they used to do basically was they used to invite in, the women would say, we want information on cost of school uniforms, or you know, what's happening with the changing welfare benefit system, or housing or education, whatever else, you know. And then they would just invite in a speaker. And I always remember, actually, it was quite interesting, and I suppose it was an implicit comment on the sort of class dimension as much as anything else, because the key worker, Kathleen, sort of said, and we're not having any academic speakers, because the women don't understand them, because they speak too long, and because, you know, and they're highfalutin. So it was very much identifying a speaker, you know, that was coming with basic information rather than a whole lot of theories. And it was to sort of say, look, it was also sort of saying, look, the women that are part of this are the women that are living the experience. So their experience is grounded, and it must be given space and validation, rather than sort of say there are these experts up here, you know, that have all the answers. It was quite a sort of a Belfast, working class Belfast sort of comment on Foucault, basically, in terms of the role of the experts, you know. But then the Women's Information Group, they also identified campaigns. So one of the big campaigns was around, they were coming together, you know, around the time of Margaret Thatcher. So you had the increase in poverty, the cuts in welfare benefits. So they started doing some joint demonstrations. And I always like this one, was a woman from the Tullycarlet Women's Group in East Belfast, and Loyalist Unionist East Belfast, saying that they, when they made the placards in the community centre, marched up to Stormont and joined the other groups to protest about this. The woman saying the last time they marched to Stormont was to bring down the power sharing executive in 1974. And they actually sent some of the women over to give it a petition at number 10 Downing Street. And there was a lovely description about how none of the women involved had ever flown before. So they put all the names into a hat and basically did a lottery as to who should go. Because again, it was this thing of you're trying to be equitable, you know, and to sort of say, look, any woman here has the experience to actually deliver this petition. So it was very much around participative and consensual decision making. But what was sort of interesting and what kept the Women's Information Day going was they didn't discuss controversial constitutional issues. It was all issues that were social and economic basic. And the thinking was that during the actual height of the conflict, if you had discussed, the border, or whether you want to make it Ireland, or whether you want union with Britain or whatever else, it was strict rule. So you sort of kept at the level of social and economic issues on the basis that the important thing was the relationship building that challenged the stereotypes, because stereotypes clearly had grown as people were living in divided communities. And that with that relationship building, it was then up to the women themselves. If they wanted to talk over lunch, it was always lunch, it was always a morning, then lunch. If they wanted to talk over lunch to somebody else from another community about a particular political issue, that was up to them. But the formal sort of setup didn't look at those sort of issues. They did, however, interestingly, look at women's right to choose, which was, on the basis that the women themselves said they were interested in that. And that obviously at the time, still is to an extent, was quite a controversial issue. And the sort of approach that the Women's Information Day took in terms of looking at social and economic issues, and not necessarily the controversial big politics issues, was the same that the trade union movement took in terms of keeping sort of women together as sort of on a cross-community basis. Though it was interesting because at the time, for a period, I was the women's organiser of the Transport General Workers Union, which obviously is now Unite, big general workers union. And what we did find was that some issues that were very difficult and would come up at trade union conferences in the form of motions, like, for example, the opposition to women being strip searched in Armagh prison at the time. I went to this motion and said, this is going to be dynamite, because my committee probably would have been 70% Protestant Unionist, 30% Catholic Nationalist. But when we actually talked it through, not from the basis of looking at the words of the motion, where people would have immediately split because they would have seen the party politics of it, we sort of said, no, we'll go back to first principles. So what are the first principles? In this case, human rights. So let's have a discussion about, forget the motion, let's have a discussion about human rights. And what then is the sort of context that you might put strip searching in? Is it a breach of human rights? Is it completely essential for security in prisons or whatever else? And they actually agreed to support the motion that strip searching was an abuse of human rights, but on that basis. So you almost broadened the discussion and framed it from the point of view of the principle before people got caught up on who the winners and who the losers from this motion. And they made it very clear when they supported it, we are not supporting it because it might be seen as Republican or from that constituency. We are supporting it on the basis of human rights. So again, taking those social and economic issues, sometimes people say, but the women were just avoiding the issues. But actually, sometimes, those more basic issues can lead to a more open and inclusive discussion about very difficult issues. So that was the Women's Information Group, and it did bring together, at times, it still goes, though I think probably with less women involved now, but it used to bring together 200 women from all those different local communities, really just at the cost of putting on a bus and a little bit of childcare and some lunch. But it was very much based on the fact of our single identity communities. And as you know, that's the peace wall, in inverted commas, that runs down Springfield Road, and obviously one of very many. And it was one of the issues that obviously impacted on the early years of trying to organise women, because the peace walls did frame, really, I suppose, community perceptions over long periods of time, and the narrative, really, of what was happening. So on the one side, it was seen as, on the Republican side, the Republican National side, it was seen as a conflict with the British. It was seen as a reaction to British policies, security policies, and it was seen as a struggle for United Ireland. On the other side, it was seen as undermining the existing constitutional situation in terms of union with Britain. It was seen as an unwarranted rebellion, and as it was seen as an attack on the beleaguered sort of Protestant Unionist loyalist population. And it's interesting how we actually get to reframe things. I'll come onto this when we talk about crafting the Good Friday Agreement. Because one of the real annoyances on the Protestant side was that the minority in Northern Ireland, Catholic Republican minority, always have the best press. They've all the international press because they are the victims. What is interesting, because I once saw a framing back in actually about the early 1970s, which made a lot of sense. It said Northern Ireland is a double minority situation. Catholic Republican community are certainly a minority within Northern Ireland, but the Protestant Unionist population are a tiny minority on the island of Ireland. And people always look to see where their vulnerabilities will be. And it sort of explained a bit the Middle Eastern situation. That, you know, that the Palestinians may be a minority within the state of Israel. Israel sees themselves as a tiny minority in the pan-Arab region. And people look to, you know, where their vulnerabilities will be, and similarly in Northern Ireland. And then obviously with the sort of the times, the insecurity because the bombing campaigns and the sectarian assassinations and shootings and so forth that were marked around the peace walls. And coming from North Belfast, I mean, do you feel that there's the same angst around peace walls now as you would have got then?
I think it kind of gone under the radar that it's North Belfast that peace wall has come down in. And nobody seems to notice that it's come down. Nobody said anything. And it was really nice when they came to pull down and makes the area much nicer. But nobody speaks about it.
So it's done without publicity or?
Yeah, it's just kind of done. It was done with the people in Ardagh, the people behind the wall and consulted. But it's just been so quietly done.
So the earth hasn't fallen in?
Yeah. Yeah. And it would just be nice to see it go down on the other side as well.
But the important thing probably from what you're saying is it was done with the people. That
Yeah.
it wasn't just a macro policy decision. It was saying we're going to level these and
Yeah, and it was done around about the time as well that the whole situation was resolved. So it was not.
Yeah.
But it does, like, there are, like, if you go into sort of like the footpath where down, there's lots of like empty houses and stuff where they've built new houses and there's lots to live in.
So there's still a concern about being on the forefront of the divide between areas.
I think as well, I'm in my legislation peace walls, so I was working with forever for Kilmurray, and I think a lot of the work that goes into actually getting peace wall down, it's sort of, it's not publicised, but there's an awful lot, you know what I mean? It's just all the work they do, it's the Lodge and Duncan Gardens, and you know, the relationships, you know, through cross-community things, things like there, and I think a lot of the work goes into it unseen, from the marble wall coming down, about forging the two communities together, you know, and then the emergence of New York yet, and the streets there, they're trying to like sort of bring inclusive neutral spaces where both communities can go. So I think it's good that there are starting to come down, but the work that goes in is actually, it's not a matter of just turning the wall down, there's a lot of unseen work that goes into it before it can come down.
And I think that's an important point because quite often that sort of process work is almost, you know, devalued or unrecognised, and the product, you know, is the policymakers' emphasis on the product, and politicians' emphasis very often on the product. We have managed to do this, but that long process that is necessary to actually enable that to take place can be undervalued.
Yeah, I think they have a lot of sort of, when I was speaking to them, you know, a lot of the issues they have is with a lot of the police and sort of multidisciplinary interaction, with how they sort of represent the nationalist Republican communities. They're very hard to get loyalists, politicians on board with this for some reason. They said it's just not happening in that specific area, which I found quite interesting. You know, it needs to be, I think, sort of we'll sort of mix it, everybody join together to do it rather than just certain individuals, you know.
And I think that also brings in the, sorry,
I'm going to interrupt. Some of the webinar participants can't hear the class discussions, so sorry to ask whenever you're speaking, can you speak up a wee bit, please?
All right.
Yes, thank you.
I think that also brings in the issue that, again, you get in the conflict situation of territoriality.
Yeah.
That, you know, particularly North Belfast, perhaps some of those loyalist politicians feel if they engage in that discussion, they will be ceding territory because it's in many ways a slightly declining population that they're representing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also being aware of some of those fears.
Yeah. And it is, it's like you were saying, you know, like there was sort of overcrowding in the Legal area, and there were so many other places in Tigers Bay, and you're sort of going like, you know, it used to be simple justice, but because of the territorial issue and the boundaries,
I would say that was a lot of that stopped it happening was the DUP, because they stopped Kirby barracks being turned into housing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say why, and the why is the vote.
Yeah. But interestingly, I found it quite interesting watching the elections in North Belfast, is that a lot of the old school DUP people have been voted out, so we no longer have Nelson Coslins, and even on the council, it was new people that were voted in. So there's obviously disquiet in the community because they're not voting for the people who
Would have that.
would have been in that position, especially where I live, because you can move for signing Nelson Coslins before the election, and people just didn't vote for him. So they obviously don't are represented by that anymore.
Yeah, that's good. But the other interesting point there is, you know, particularly in terms of peace agreements, is, I mean, you could look at that situation and say, well, that's just nasty sectarian attitudes. They don't want to move. But actually, there are two real reasons there. There's a loss of territory and more Catholics going to that community, the Catholic nationalist community, means that there will be a loss of political representation. Now, it's not an excuse, but once you actually understand it, you can then start trying to unpick it. Mm-hmm. You know, that there's a rationale there. It's not just irrational emotional response. But once you can actually then get the reason, you can start trying to untangle it and see is there solutions or ways around it. Sometimes there's not, you know, at least it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's just, looking back over that period, some lessons from that early women's activism. First of all, that it is possible to involve women and enhance women's participation despite ongoing political differences. You know, if you take the line, oh, well, we can't do it until everybody has some frame of agreement, not going to happen. Because obviously, particularly during the violence, you know, there was no prospect of political agreement. So you were having to try to mobilize around shared concerns. And we used to talk about, you know, politics with a big P, in inverted commas, and that was the big political talks. And politics with a small p, which was largely these sort of issues, but were equally important because they were the issues that actually impacted people's everyday lives. And they were the issues that women felt that they had the confidence to actually say what was happening because they were basically living it. So mobilizing around those shared concerns. Now, alongside that community movement, there was, as we had the earlier slide from Women's Aid and the women's centres and women's rights movement, there was also a feminist discussion ongoing, but it tended to be, and I was part of it tended, with the benefit of hindsight, to be quite exclusive, because it tended to be more ideological. You know, were you a socialist feminist, or were you a nationalist feminist? I don't think there was an argument put forward for loyalist feminism. There might be one or two, but that's not very many. But actually, people like ourselves, and my only excuse was I was in my 20s, you got so caught up in those discussions, and particularly, within the university context, whatever else, you forgot how excluding it was to people that didn't relate to it, And I always remember, you would, in fact, there was so many different splinter groups and different points of view at one point that we actually instituted Saturday morning unity meetings, where all the different groups were to come together and see what to try and draw what would unite us. And you returned to the pub afterwards because there was nothing unifying about the things. They were all trying to point score. It was like being in political negotiations. But because people got caught up in that, they would sit round over the gin and tonic or whatever and say, where are women from the Protestant working class? But actually, the sort of framing of the discussion was completely excluded them in terms of the assumptions that were taken as normal or whatever else. And again, it was a bit like what I said earlier, the importance of organising in a conflict society of being conscious and being aware of the words you use, the terminology you use, where you meet, who you're assuming that you're going to meet with, in terms of the impact on people from other perspectives. We had the single issue organisations that did include people from across the sectarian divide, particularly things like domestic violence, because clearly it impacted everybody, with the rape crisis that had been set up, it impacted everybody. And we had then, by the late 80s, starting to be more sensitive and more critical awareness. We had what Cynthia Coburn, in a wonderful book she wrote in 1998, called The Space Between Us, called Transversal Politics. And it was actually a book that was looking at the Women's Support Network in Northern Ireland, developments in Bosnia, and developments in Israel-Palestine. And what she was sort of looking at was the ability over time by women's centres or women's organisations to work with women of different political perspectives, very often quite firmly held political perspectives, but in a context where they respected that difference. So you went from a situation of, if you like, trying to win your perspective, your political perspective by argument, into a situation of saying, no, we can work together on these range of issues, but you have a right to have a different macro political perspective. And that was a big shift. And I think it was also a shift almost out of the, if you like, the sort of the Marxism of the 1960s and 70s, where it was a matter of, backing ideologies, to a situation of sort of saying, almost more strategic understanding of the way we can work together and get things done is by getting this level of agreement. And to an extent also humanizing the situation. These people are not just enemies or suffering from false consciousness, as was always said in Marxist terms. They're actually people that have real life stories, have real life experiences, may have been forced out of their homes through intimidation, may have had members of their family shot, and there's reasons why they hold these views. And then we were starting to look at the representation of women around not just women's issues, but also realizing that women's issues, like domestic violence or rape or whatever else, or poverty, needed the big politics to take those into account if there's going to be any change. Otherwise, we could do pamphlets, collect evidence, do petitions, but things weren't necessarily changed. But there was still the problem of the conflict and violence, albeit that I reckon that women in Northern Ireland probably had a bit of an easier time. They weren't as targeted as men, so they could move easier, I think, than young men, in fairness. However, this quote here is from a woman who was working with the Tully Carter Women's Centre, and she was basically saying that you forget that actually people weren't travelling very much. She sort of said, you know, going from East Belfast down to Newtownards Road City Centre was a big journey. And what she tried to do then was to bring people into the community to discuss issues. And actually, her organised history lectures came because some of the women were using the word Fenian in a derogatory sense, so their own Fenians. She said, well, do you know where that word comes from? The Fenian movement in 1870, whatever. Anyway, she brought in a Queen's University history lecturer, which went against Women's Information Group approach. But anyway, she brought in this guy called Grant Wright, who did a lot of history lectures in Shankill and different places. To actually describe, you know, some of the background of history. And she got called in by the UDA, local guys, basically saying, I hear you've got some interesting history lessons going on. And what it was didn't stop it, but it was almost this sense of, but watch the limits. You know, we know what's going on, don't push the limits too far, we're keeping an eye. So there was almost this sense of, you know, you can do things, but within limits, basically. And then, by 1994, we had the ceasefires. That was the headline in the Belfast Telegraph. So that, to an extent, changed the context, because clearly what you could do, even with, you know, unsettled ceasefires, was considerably more in terms of women's representation than you could do in conflict periods. However, I would still argue that, you know, when you're talking about peace building, the United Nations quite often initially has talked about peace building as being post-ceasefire. Actually, peace building can go on right through the conflict by sort of bringing people together around those shared issues. And very often, actually, the credibility that women had was because they were there during that conflict period. You know, we had a whole plethora of people coming in, particularly from outside the international community, after the ceasefires. But you always needed the memory of how to bring people together and the sensitivities for the conflict period to be effective in that post-conflict, post-ceasefire period. But before the ceasefires, we also had two very interesting initiatives. They weren't specifically women, but women were involved in them, that created some of the confidence building around. I mean, the period of the early 1990s actually was very violent. And it's one of the things, again, talking about peace building, I'd say to people is, look, you know, don't get upset if violence starts to rise, because sometimes in that situation, it was almost people getting the revenge in first before calling the ceasefires. So sometimes actually you get some grudges against someone that had shot somebody else, so that, you know, they weren't going to be able to shoot them after ceasefires, so they shot them before them. You know, which is, you know, but also because to an extent, if an armed group is going to go towards a ceasefire, they want to go into it strong. So quite often you get an upsurge in violence before you actually get a change. And similarly, actually, in what we found during the talks, during the political negotiations, you can get a hardening of rhetoric before actually people start making compromises. Because again, it's almost like you're marking your ground, and if we're going to compromise from here rather than here, so that, you know, so that we get as much as we can. So the two initiatives that I just wanted to mention before the ceasefires, I think that were important, was the OPSAL Commission. Anyone remember anything of the OPSAL Commission? No. It happened in 1992, 2 years before the ceasefire. And as I say, the situation was very violent, but civil society decided they put together this panel of people drawn from two from Northern Ireland, two from America, chaired by a Norwegian guy who's very active in peace building, a couple from Britain. And they said, right, we want to invite submissions from anybody, any group, any organisation, any party, any individual who's a view about the future of Northern Ireland. And they went out and they held verbal gatherings and they invited written submissions, whatever else. The important thing was they invited submissions from the various loyalist parties and Sinn Féin, who at that stage would have been banned from the airwaves. So what they were saying was, we want an inclusive discussion about the future of Northern Ireland. And it allowed groups that previously had been somewhat excluded to actually have their policies put on the table along with everything else. And the other very interesting initiative that, again, I think is sort of lost in history was happened across the Peace Wall on Springfield Road between Protestant Shankill and Catholic Nationalist West Belfast. And it was the setting up of something called the Springfield Inter-Community Development Project. And what they did was they formed a management committee of people involved from both sides across the peace line. And they employed a number of loyalist ex-prisoners, recent ex-prisoners in the UDF, and a number of Republican ex-prisoners in the IRA as their workers. Now, this initiative was about area planning, socioeconomic planning. In fact, what it was also doing was it was allowing informal back-channel communications between both the management committee and the workers at the same time that you had the informal back-channel negotiations going on between the IRA and the UDF in Clonard Monastery with Father Alice Reid. And I remember interviewing some of the people that worked on that initiative, and both sides saying, but particularly the UDF workers saying, I would feed back to the UDF command what I was hearing, which supported what they were hearing in the political negotiations. So again, it was using the community and community links to actually provide confidence building that allowed sort of the macro politics sort of to take root. But in that situation, we had a politically inherited context that was really important as we go into the talks. First of all, I talked about narrative. You had a narrative within Catholic Republican supplementary areas of one making sense of what's going on. You had a very different one in Protestant Unionist loyalist areas, who by this stage was actually talked about pan-nationalism. You know, they're all over there, they're all united, they're organised around parishes, they're all armed. And actually, within the nationalist community, there was murder going on between the Catholic Church, the SDLP, Sinn Féin, the Irish National Liberation Armies against the IRA, there was feuds, they were fighting. But on the Protestant side, it looked as though it was one homogeneous entity. So again, those sort of conflicting narratives that you get. And then we had the macro narrative, which was very important in the British government, which dated back to 1975, that the situation in Northern Ireland was not a war, was not a political struggle, it was an aggravated crime wave. And they came in with this normalisation, criminalisation, posterisation. In other words, it was an all society that had a major crime wave and would be dealt with by the local police force. And everybody knew, who looked out a window, that that wasn't the situation. But that was the narrative that was put in place in order to contain the situation, because at the time one of the demands was to bring in the United Nations. And the British government didn't want the situation internationalised. But it's interesting, because that was the narrative that still pertains. So actually today, we can't apply UN 1325 in Northern Ireland formally, because we're still described as a non-political, a non-war situation. And that hasn't changed, and it's actually one of the problems, to be quite honest, that is also booby-trapped discussions around dealing with the past, which is the current negotiations we have up in Stormont today. Because if it's not a political struggle or whatever else, if it's a crime wave, and then the Unionist Party then sort of picked up on that, well then why would you have a major inquiry into dealing with the past?
Is there a motive for that? Is there a motive that the British government are keeping it that way?
I think partially because it has now become almost so normalised, particularly for unionist communities, who picked up on that. It was originally a British government instruction, particularly by Roy Mason at the time. And whether it's actually been formally challenged, I don't really know. Because actually, arguably, in terms of that dealing with the past debate, it would unleash some more possibilities if the British government stood up and sort of said, well, actually, we accept it was a political struggle, because implicitly they did in the Good Friday Agreement, but it never explicitly was accepted as such.
Strange.
And as I say, you sort of forget about it until, I mentioned it later on, we were doing a project on UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in Northern Ireland. And of course then we invited somebody to the DP, in fact, I think, and the letter came back saying, oh no, it can't be recognised in Northern Ireland because it was struggle. So, it's the formality actually would be tracking the reality, if you like, And then, of course, you had, as I mentioned, the mutually exclusive single identity narratives. You had the militarised context that was inherited, and we had certainly around the ceasefire period, and arguably as well still to an extent, the absence of confidence, trust, and positive relationships. There was obviously relationships across the peace lines, but they were narrow. But then we had the role of civil society, which I think was very important in keeping some level of relationships going. The Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action, which is the coordinating body of the community voluntary sector in Northern Ireland, set up what they call the G8, which is a play on the G8, the big G8 that you get meeting internationally. But it was the farmers' unions, it was the employers, it was the trade unions, it was the voluntary sector, who again kept meeting to actually argue for a peace process. So it's look, economy needs it, civil society needs whatever else. I mentioned the Opsal Commission. You had some very early NGO initiatives, again, trying to move stuff forward. NIACRO, which was the Northern Ireland Association Care and Settlement of Offenders, before the ceasefires actually, carried out a study into the early release of political prisoners. And they looked at the Red Brigades, they looked at the Basques, they looked at Israel-Palestine, and they looked at South Africa. And they went back with stuff to Northern Ireland and said, look, if there is to be a peace process, this has to be on the table. And that at the time was treated with, you can't talk about things like this, whereas obviously in another 2 years it became a central platform. And then you have community cover for confidence building. So for example, again, pre-ceasefires, whenever President Mary Robinson from the Republic came up to meet groups in Belfast, she met the Windsor Women's Centre, she met groups in West Belfast. She also then, as part of that meeting, met in County Jerry Adams. So again, it was the importance of sending out signals all the time. If you move, there will be receptivity. But it was done on the basis of, well, it was at a meeting that the Falls Community Council had organised. So, so it's looking for ways, it's looking for ways, of actually sending out some of those signals in such a way that will not be major, cause major sort of reaction or confrontation with people with a different view. And around that period, these three quotes I always quite like. The first one relates to the mutually exclusive identities, or narratives. It's actually from a woman that ran the outreach of the Belfast Higher Education Institute in West Belfast. And the day of the ceasefire, she was mentioning people for the next term's classes. And she said, oh my God, this is amazing. So she went off to buy some champagne to celebrate it. And there was a guy from the Central Biffy institution there, and he said he thought they were actually getting the champagne because of the enrollment. And he said, do you do this all the time? And I said, the ceasefire has just been announced? Oh, he says, no impact at all. So again, in a society,
Sorry, what's Biffy?
it's the old tech, it's the Belfast Institute for Higher Education. So even, within an institution like that, people coming from a different context just couldn't, it didn't resonate because, as compared to people that were living in a situation of conflict. The second one is actually also shows that it's not just within local areas. That this actually was a quote from a senior civil servant, who should be nameless, and he talked about some of the first meetings after the ceasefire with the Republican side, and he said he was talking about how both sides were reacted. On the Sinn Féin side, they sent in somebody from North Belfast, who wants to be nameless, though can be thought, with a trench coat, just simply to stay out, because he was seen as the hard man, one of the now leading politicians in North Belfast. And the senior civil servant on the Northern Ireland office side had to pray the night before because of the idea of meeting somebody from Sinn Féin. So again, it shows how deeply divided the attitudes were before he went to the meeting. And the civil servant was saying, well, actually, it would be unimaginable the other way around if they'd been meeting loyalist paramilitaries, because they weren't seen as such a threat. They were in some ways seen as protecting the Union. And the last quote is again quite nice. It's from a senior Northern Ireland office official who said, talked about again the tentativeness of change when you have that sort of situation of ceasefire. And he was sort of saying, that he and his officials were the official handshakers, because no government minister could be seen to be shaking hands with somebody from the Republican side, because unionists would see that as sellout, basically. So whenever a hand came out, one of the officials would shake it, so the government minister didn't have to. So something as simple as that became really such an issue. Actually, there's another lovely quote from that particular official as well, where he was talking about this macro narrative from the British government. And he said, I was writing answers to parliamentary questions for Westminster, the ministers, saying that Northern Ireland is generally a normal, civilised society, but unfortunately, we have a crime wave, and the police are dealing it. Why is it we had RUC officers go around carrying bazookas? So he himself was laughing in retrospect, but he said, we had to do it because that was the frame, basically. So going into the peace talks, that was the sort of context that we were dealing with. The lack of trust, people feeling very, coming from very sort of entrenched positions, the uncertainty about what was happening, the uncertainty whether the ceasefires would hold, and of course, at one point they didn't hold, and this sense of that not only was it the decision makers and policy makers that had that lack of trust, but there was also a lack of understanding from people across broader society. And it's quite interesting, that top quote. You look what's happened in Colombia recently, where the ceasefire agreement was conducted, but the referendum wasn't passed. And it probably reflects that top quote, which is a lack of understanding from people outside the intensity of the politics and of those communities caught in the politics. So when you do get that lack of understanding, then it's very easy for seeds of doubt to be sown about, are we signing up to, we've been told for decades these people are terrorists, or scum, whatever else, and suddenly we're being asked to, have these agreements with them. And I think that quote looks towards that as well. So I'm conscious we're coming towards coffee break, but perhaps just in terms of the women's issue, this was a new political dispensation. So we've got John Hume up here, SDLP. We've got David Trimble, Unionist leader. Davy Irvine, Progressive Unionist Party leader, UPF links. Martin McGuinness, Reading Unpublished. John Major was the British Prime Minister at the time. Gerry Adams, Sinn Féin. That's Senator George Mitchell, who was brought in as the independent US chair of the talks. John Alderdice, leader of the Alliance Party. Ian Paisley, DUP. That's Patrick Mayhew was the Secretary of State at the time. Albert Reynolds, Taoiseach, Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. And Gary McMichael, head of the Ulster Democratic Party. Those were the parties that were around in 1994 period that were going to discuss peace talks. And the interesting thing with those people were, with the exception of Davy Irvine, Gary McMichael, And to a limited extent, though, I mean, Jerry Adams had been around, obviously, he was a known entity. Martin McGuinness was coming in, really, I suppose, for the first time at that stage. All the other people had been talking at each other for years. You know? They had been, many of these people had been involved back over the Anglo-Irish Agreement back in 1985, and even some of them, like John Hume, would have gone back to the power sharing section since 1974. So in many ways, a lot of these men would have assumed that they knew what the other men actually were looking for and what they thought. So that was the sort of framing of peace talks. Now my last slide before we break for coffee is how do women then make the most of that change? Because there was a sense, which I think we saw lost sometime about 2002, 2003, there was almost a sense of, hey, we can remake the world, you know, things are possible. So one of the things that basically was possible was the fact that there was a new electoral system brought in to elect parties in peace talks. And again, this is one of my Northern Ireland office officials reflecting on that. And he said, look, he said, you know, we had 10 parties at the peace talks, we gerrymandered it so that there were the 10 parties. But after a while, people forgot about the different sizes of parties. Now, I don't think they did actually, but he claimed they did. And the reason that they gerrymandered it was to get in the small parties associated with the loyalist countries. Progressive Unionist Party and the Ulster Democratic Party. They wanted inclusive peace talks. They knew they had to be there. They weren't sure they would get elected. They knew Sinn Féin would get elected and SDLP and all the rest of them. So what they did was they developed an electoral system, which basically it was a collective vote right across Northern Ireland, and then the 10 parties that got the top vote would be at the table. And what they also did, which actually was one of the roots of the Women's Coalition, was in the first communication from the governments, they named the parties that would contest that election. Now, even before that happened, back in January, February 1996, women had started coming together to sort of say, right, we have all these roots here, we have all this, you know, expertise, we have all these experience of meeting and networking and nuancing conference motions and whatever else. How can we get our voice into that lineup of men? And that's not to say that there wasn't women in those parties, but they tend to be at a non-decision making level. So the women in the parties attempted to set up what was called the Women's Political Association, which was borrowed from what was happening down in the Republic of Ireland, where women across parties, different political parties of the Republic, came together on a set of lead issues to push. Very often things like domestic violence, whatever else. And the women up here from different parties tried to set that up. It's met a few times, but it didn't really work and didn't attract in some of the unionist parties. The Progressive Unionist Party was there, but not the main unionist parties. There was also a big Women in Politics conference in Draperstown held in 1995, summer, that actually was organised through here, through UU, Monica McWilliams organised it, with the encouragement of the then Direct Rule Minister Boris Denton in the Northern Ireland office, who actually was very annoyed at the way she was treated, let alone how women were being treated generally. And she gave a bit of money to bring women together at that conference. And the first idea of setting up a women's party was floated at that, with very mixed reactions, because clearly women who were active in Sinn Féin or the Unionist Party or SDLP didn't want another competitive party. So that was interesting discussion, but unresolved in terms of how we go forward. There was this Beijing UN Women's Conference happening at that year, so there was a lot of discussion about women in decision making. And actually, the locally based women's groups, we got some money together to send a delegation of about 14 to Beijing. And a number came from those local women's groups that actually were part of the Women's Information Group. And what they did was, the local groups, they all embroidered a patch to represent their area views, and it was sewn together as a patchwork quilt, and it was brought to Beijing by the delegation. And that was 1995, I think. So, there was quite a bit of, and then there was report backs and things like that. We also had Women's Sport Network, which was the networking body for all the women's centres, starting to have women in politics courses in local communities. In terms of, again, sort of, not in terms of taking a line on the big P issues, but at least putting them in the political context and explaining what's happening and the possibilities. And then in Republican areas, you had women coming together who would have been part of the Republican movement in a process that they called Cardamom, which is a women's platform, if you like, agenda, because they were also starting to say, we want to make sure that our own parties have a women's perspective. And then from following up at the Draperstown conference, we had the Northern Ireland Women's European Platform, which would be PIVA, actually, who still exists. And they were working with some of the women that have been involved in the Women in Politics conference to critique what was coming out of the government, to say, how dare you tell us what parties would stand? What parties could stand? And they also put in a paper very early on about gender-proofing the electoral system. Because at that stage, we were actually arguing, we were looking towards, say, some of the Scandinavian proportional representation systems where women have to appear at certain levels on the lists that are put forward. And one of the things I learned from that period was there's nothing sacrosanct about electoral systems. Well, if you go to England, they say, oh, it has to be first past the post or whatever. There's a huge range of electoral systems around the world, and they all produce different results. So the actual mechanisms of the system are really important, rather than just actually implementing whatever systems they are. And actually, what happened then was, in terms of the British government and the Irish government, say, agreeing these are the parties that would elect, would stand in the elections, a number of us got together and got one of our friends, Rona Hines from the Northern Ireland Women's European Platform, to ring the Northern Ireland office and complain, which she did, as only Rona can do in a forceful manner. And the official at the other end of the phone says, well, he says, but what other parties are there? And she said, well, there could be a women's party. Oh, he said, I better ring you back. So he rang her back in half an hour and said, what's the name of the women's party? So Rona said, oh, she says, I'll ring you back. Because there was no women's party at this stage, So then frantic tacking phone calls around 4 or 5 of us and said, well, look, we better put in a name to hold the space, and then we'll see if we can, if we can actually make a reality of what our people want to do, So I said, what do we call it, So then somebody came up with the idea of Women's Coalition. And I said, we can't call it that, because you can imagine the headlines, WC. So he sort of said, no, it has to be the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, because then it needs to be NIWC, not just WC. So Rhoda rang the NIO back and said, it's the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Right, he says. And then we went on and had meetings all around it. So that's how it sort of got going. Rather, it wasn't really any long, well thought out, detailed strategy. It was almost just sheer annoyance at what they were doing, and then having to take the opportunity very fast. So I'll leave it there, and we'll break for coffee for 15 minutes, and then the next bit then I want to look at the coalition and some of the local solutions. Okay. Any last questions before you go for coffee and what we've done so far? No.
See how it sort of started, the process of that?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, because the coalition couldn't have come together without those roots.
Yeah.
Because we would be able to pull from those roots. But it's those roots that remain, which was one of your points, completely lost in history. Because they weren't seen as important. They were seen old women.
Yeah, because I didn't know that until I did the reading for this class that there was a women's party. No, I have no idea. Wish there still was.
Yeah.
Another's question
Yep.
from Rebecca online, and could you please elaborate on the Women into Politics courses?
Yes, the Women to Politics courses were essentially sort of done on a fairly informal, discursive basis, but it was sort of explaining what things like electoral systems were to women, and particularly because we have proportional representation in Northern Ireland as our system, which isn't the most straightforward, so explaining how people could use the electoral system. Secondly, it was introducing them to the various political parties, and the courses they would invite in not just women but speakers representing all the different political parties in Northern Ireland, so people could ask them questions but also get a sense of their policies. And then thirdly, it was looking at what were the political institutions, coming out of this 1996 period. We had the peace talks, but we also had a forum for political dialogue set up. And then latterly, obviously, we had the assembly and the different assembly committees. So really sharing information about the political system, the electoral system, and then the political parties. And then with some discussion around the side about how women could actually get involved in more formal politics.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Copy. Back then about 11 or so.